There is a number buried inside the mythology of regular show that almost nobody sits with long enough to feel the weight of, and it is this. Pops and his brother are fated to fight for the fate of the universe once every 14 billion years, and in every single time before the finale, the fight ends in a draw, and the draw resets the entire universe from nothing. 14 billion years is roughly the age of everything. That means the show is quietly telling you, in the space of a few lines of dialogue near its very end, that the reality you have been watching for 8 seasons might not be the first version of it. It might not be the 10th. It might not be a number with a name. Tonight we are looking for the parts of regular show that were never built to be comforting, the theories that sit underneath the comedy like cold water under a thin sheet of ice, the ones that, once you actually let them land, are not fun little factoids. They are the kind of thing that changes how you watch a rerun of a show you have loved since you were a teenager. I am Velvo. This one is going to be a little heavier than usual, so if you are here to drift off tonight, that is exactly what this is built for too, because the heaviness moves slow and it moves quiet. Nothing tonight is going to arrive as a jump scare or a shock cut. It is going to arrive the way most real unease arrives, slowly, through a detail you already knew, sitting a little differently than it used to once somebody finally says it out loud. Get comfortable. Let us go looking at the parts of the park that were never meant to be looked at directly for very long. Where and what time are you watching this from tonight? Type it in the comments before you get too settled in, because I always like knowing where these videos land, what city, what country, what hour of the night you decided this was the thing you wanted, playing while the world outside your window went quiet. Now let us keep going. Start with the number itself, because everything else tonight builds outward from it. The reveal comes late, in the show's final stretch, once the show has already spent 7.5 seasons training you to see Pops as comic relief, a sweet, slightly senile man with a head shaped like a lollipop who lives in a mansion and gets confused by ordinary things. The show waits until it has fully earned your affection for him before it tells you what he actually is. His birth name, confirmed in the show's own canon, is Megacranus, and he was born on a planet called Lollyland, as what his species considers its highest possible state, a kind of living embodiment of pure good. But the universe the show is built on does not allow that kind of purity to exist without a counterweight. The instant Megacranus was born, his opposite came into being to balance him, a being called Malamcranus, who the show later calls Antipops. The two of them are not separate accidents who happen to hate each other. They are two halves of a single cosmic event, and the show's own mythology states plainly that they are fated to fight for the fate of the universe, and that every previous fight between them, going back through unthinkable stretches of time, has ended exactly the same way. A stalemate. And the stalemate does not just fail to resolve anything. It resets the universe entirely and starts the whole thing over. Sit with that for a second, because it deserves more than a passing mention. If the finale is telling the truth about the mechanics of this fight, then the universe you have been watching, the actual park, the actual house, the actual coffee shop, Mordecai and Rigby's actual friendship, all of it, might be sitting on top of a stack of identical universes that got this far and then failed. Not failed in some abstract mythological sense, failed the exact way this one very nearly did, right up until the moment Pops chose something different than punching his brother. The show frames this gently, almost as a footnote on the way to its actual emotional climax. But the implication underneath it is enormous, and if you let it be, genuinely unsettling. It means the version of the story where Mordecai and Rigby grow up, where Rigby finally goes back and finishes high school, where Skips gets to rest, where the park survives, might be one success sitting on top of an uncountable number of failures that never got the chance to be watched by anyone, that simply blinked out and restarted from zero the second the two brothers' fists connected. The show does not dwell on those failed universes. It does not need to. The mere fact that they are implied is enough to turn the finale, when you rewatch it with this in your head, from a story about a victory into a story about the one time out of who knows how many that it actually worked. There is a colder way to phrase the same idea, and it comes from a corner of the fandom that treats this pattern less as tragic and more as clinical. The theory goes that Anti-Pops does not actually hate his brother out of malice in the way the show's comic framing sometimes suggests. He is simply doing what he was built to do, the same way Pops is simply doing what he was built to do. Two forces in perfect opposition, cycling through the same confrontation across a timescale so vast it makes human history look like a rounding error, locked into an outcome that repeats itself with the reliability of a law of physics rather than the uncertainty of a choice. Under this reading, free will barely enters into the equation until the very last possible second, the moment Pops, informed by knowledge from a life he technically should not remember, decides to hug his brother instead of hit him. Everything before that moment, across every one of those unspoken prior cycles, was mechanical, deterministic, a cosmic pendulum swinging the same arc since before the concept of time, as we understand it, existed. The show frames the ending as an act of love winning out over violence, and it is, and that reading is not wrong. But it sits on top of a much colder architecture, one where love had to break something that had never once, in 14 billion years' times, however many repetitions came before, broken in that particular direction. What makes this land harder rather than softer, the longer you think about it, is a detail the show gives you almost as a throwaway. Mordecai and Rigby only managed to help Pops choose differently because they already lived through the ending once, watched everyone they loved get erased when the universe reset around them mid-fight, and then used footage the park crew had recorded of their own adventures to remember what happened and travel back to the one moment that mattered. In other words, the version of the finale you actually watched only exists because a worse version happened first, inside the story, in a timeline that gets folded away the second it is corrected. You watch the fixed draft. The show, almost as an aside, tells you a broken draft existed too, that Mordecai and Rigby lived inside it long enough to grieve inside it, and that the only reason you never had to watch the credits roll on that version is because two exhausted young men found a way to go back and do it again with slightly better information. That is not a small detail to bury in the middle of an action sequence. That is a description of trauma with a rewind button attached, and the show moves past it fast enough that most viewers, the first time through, do not fully register what they were just told. There is a smaller, more domestic version of this same recursive dread that runs quietly underneath a character most people think about far less than Pops, and it belongs to High Five Ghost. His story, unlike Pops's, was never resolved. The show confirms, through his own appearances, that he is a ghost, small, mostly transparent, with a single extended arm and hand growing from the top of his head, designed as a clear visual nod to the classic Pac-Man ghosts. He is voiced, and this is one of those facts that gets misattributed constantly across fan discussion, by the show's creator, J.G. Quintel, the same performer who voices Mordecai. Sam Marin, who voices three of the park's other core characters, Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, does not voice High Five Ghost at all, and getting that detail wrong is one of the most common small errors that circulates in fan summaries of the cast. Quintel gives Mordecai his voice, and also gives High Five Ghost his, which means the show's two most emotionally opposite characters in a lot of ways: the anxious, indecisive Blue Jay, who cannot commit to anything, and the quiet, steady Ghost, who almost never causes a problem, are coming out of the same throat behind the scenes. That alone would be an interesting footnote. What makes it darker is what the show never tells you about High Five Ghost's actual death, because he is never shown to have died on screen. He is simply already a ghost in every episode from his very first appearance onward, treated with the same casual acceptance the rest of the cast extends to literally every other impossible thing that happens at this park. Nobody asks him how he died. Nobody in 8 seasons and well over 250 episodes sits him down and asks the obvious, glaring question that any real person would ask a friend who was, by definition, deceased. And the show does something stranger still, something that most casual viewers never catch, because in one flashback episode, Exit 9B, High Five Ghost, is shown as an infant, already ghostly, already transparent, cradled by what appears to be an ordinary human mother. He also has a brother, Low Five Ghost, who is likewise a ghost from what the show implies has been the beginning. So the mystery is not simply, how did this character die? The mystery is deeper and stranger than that, because the show gives conflicting signals about whether he was ever alive in the conventional sense to begin with, or whether he was somehow born this way into a family that seems otherwise ordinary. And then, on top of that unresolved contradiction, the show gives you one more detail that fans have circled back to for years. In the episode, Trucker Hall of Fame, High Five Ghost visibly hates the subject of death being brought up. He flinches from it. He avoids it for a character who is definitionally dead. That reaction only makes sense if there is something underneath his calm exterior that he does not want examined too closely, something the show never gives him the screen time to actually process, because compared to almost every other member of the main cast, he simply gets less material. He is, by wide critical agreement, the most underused of the park's 7 central characters, frequently pushed into the role of Muscle Man's quieter, more logical sidekick rather than being given his own arc. Read plainly, that is simply an underwritten character, a casualty of a show juggling 7 leads across 260 plus episodes. But read the way the fandom has quietly read it for years. It becomes something closer to a horror premise hiding inside a workplace comedy. Here is a character who died. We do not know how. We do not know when. Who was possibly a baby when it happened. Who has a brother who suffered the identical unexplained fate. Who visibly cannot tolerate the subject being raised, and who the show simply declines, across its entire run, to ever give him the one conversation that would let him say out loud what happened to him. Every other major death in the show gets addressed directly, mourned, explained, sometimes reversed. High Five Ghost's death is the one the show built into its premise from episode 1 and then never once looked directly at. If you are inclined to find that theory unsettling rather than merely sad, the unsettling version goes like this. He is not avoiding the subject because it is painful in the ordinary sense, that losing a father is painful, the way Muscle Man's grief over his own father is painful. He is avoiding it because whatever happened to him and his brother was bad enough that neither of them, across the entire run of the show, has ever once been willing to speak the words out loud, even to the people who love them most. That is speculation, plainly. Nothing in the canon confirms a darker cause than a simple death nobody bothered writing an origin for. But the show's own silence on the matter, sustained deliberately across 8 seasons, is the kind of silence that starts to feel less like an oversight and more like an avoidance. The writers gave one of their own characters, and then, perhaps without fully meaning to, never broke. Now let us go to Skips, because his backstory is one of the very few in the entire show that the writers did sit down and fully explain in an episode literally titled Skip's Story, and the explanation, once you actually walk through it slowly, is one of the bleakest things regular show ever put on screen, dressed up in the show's usual 80s tinged nostalgia so effectively that a huge number of viewers walk away from the episode remembering it as sweet rather than as what it actually is. Skips, we learn, used to be an ordinary young man named Walks, alive in what the show frames as roughly the 18th or 19th century, going by the episode's own visual references to a bizarre, anachronistic high school setting populated partly by immortals. He falls in love with a girl named Mona, full name Desdemona, and the two of them spend their brief time together the way any young couple would at a school dance, trading a joke about the way they walk together that eventually gives him his adult name. Then a bully named Clorgbane the Destroyer, established by the show as a genuinely dangerous cosmic threat rather than an ordinary schoolyard tormentor, confronts Walks, and in the fight that follows, a chunk of the ceiling comes loose. Mona, seeing the debris falling toward Walks, pushes him out of its path. The concrete lands on her instead. She dies almost instantly. The show does not soften this. It happens fast, almost too fast, the way real accidents tend to happen faster than the moment can hold. What comes next is the part that turns grief into something closer to a life sentence, a group calling themselves the Guardians of Eternal Youth, the same order Skips remains loosely affiliated with for the rest of his life. Grant walks immortality specifically so that he can keep fighting Clorgbane every time the villain returns, which the show establishes happens on a cycle of 157 years. Not once, not as closure, forever on a recurring clock, for as long as Clorgbane keeps coming back, which by the internal logic of the show, he does. Walks become skips in Mona's memory, because skipping was the motion the two of them shared, and he vows from that day forward never to walk again, a vow the show maintains with remarkable consistency across the entire series, showing him break it only in a small handful of specific, heavily flagged moments. By the time we meet him in the present day timeline of the show, he is well over 250 years old. He has, by simple arithmetic, already fought Clorgbane at least once more since Mona's death, and the show sets up the expectation that he will have to do it again in another century and a half. Consider what that actually means for the version of Skips the show hands you as its wise, gentle elder statesman, the one who fixes everything, who never sits down, who the rest of the staff treats as a source of calm competence. That calm was not simply granted to him by 2.5 centuries of accumulated wisdom. It was purchased at a specific and traceable cost on a specific night by a specific loss that the show tells you, in plain, unambiguous canon, still defines the shape of his every remaining day, because he still, in the present timeline, carries the locket Mona's memory is attached to, and still, per the show's own writing, cries when he takes it out. He is not simply an old, patient man. He is a man who has been sentenced by beings who meant to help him to keep refighting the specific trauma that killed the only woman he ever loved on a recurring schedule for as long as the universe requires it of him, with no indication in the show's canon that the cycle ever actually ends. Immortality, in most stories, gets treated as a gift, or at worst, a curse of boredom. Here it is something closer to an open wound that has been surgically kept from healing on purpose by people who thought they were doing him a favor. Every time the show shows you Skips being unshakable, unbothered, endlessly capable of solving whatever cosmic disaster lands on the park that week, it is quietly asking you to forget or to simply not know that this same character is 157 years away, give or take, from having to do the one thing that broke his life the first time all over again. There is a theory that extends naturally out of this, one that treats his choice to ride motorcycles, shown recurring across multiple episodes, as something more than a stylistic preference. The reading, which is interpretation rather than anything the show confirms directly, is that Skips gravitates toward motion that is fast, mechanical, and specifically not walking, because walking is the motion he shared with nobody else, the motion that belongs entirely and only to the version of himself that existed before the ceiling came down. Skipping was Mona's. Walking was his own, ordinary, human, and it died along with the part of him that used to be Walk's. Every vehicle he climbs onto since then, in this reading, is a small additional distance placed between himself and the version of motion he can no longer allow himself to return to. Nothing in the show states this explicitly. It is a pattern, noticed and extended by longtime viewers, that fits neatly enough into everything else the show tells you about him that it has become one of the more durable readings of his character, even without a single line of dialogue confirming it outright. Now widen the frame a little, because Skips's grief is not actually an outlier inside this show. It is closer to the norm than most viewers realize once you start counting. This is a comedy that treats sudden, graphic, often played for laughs death as one of its single most reliable narrative devices, and the frequency with which it does. This is, once you actually sit down and tally the examples, one of the stranger facts about the show's entire run. There is a real, verified detail here worth knowing. Regular show carried a TV PG rating for most of its run, and at times, specifically, a TV PG V rating, the V standing for violence, a rating tier that put it in genuinely unusual company for a cartoon airing in the same daytime lineup as shows built for much younger audiences. And the show's creator, J.G. Quintel, has spoken publicly and on record about exactly how far the show initially pushed that rating. In an interview published in the trade press in 2026, Quintel described how, in the earliest seasons, Cartoon Network gave the writers room to test the boundaries of what a TV PG cartoon could contain, and the writers, by his own account, ran with that freedom aggressively enough that network executives eventually stepped in with a direct note asking the team to tone things down and remove some of what they had been putting on screen. That is not fan speculation. That is the show's own creator describing, years after the fact, a real moment where the people funding the show looked at what his team had made and decided it had gone further than they were comfortable airing. It is worth knowing, too, where all of this actually came from before it was ever a television show at all. Regular Show began its life as a pitch inside Cartoon Network's short-lived Cartoonstitute program, an initiative that specifically told a handful of independent artists to make whatever pilot they wanted, with no network notes attached, on the chance that one of them might get optioned into a full series. Quintel built his pitch directly out of characters from two of his own student films from his time at CalArts, one called Two in the AM/PM, the other called The Naive Man from Lollyland, both personal, low-budget projects made years before Cartoon Network was involved at all, made with nobody checking what tone was or was not appropriate for daytime television. Regular Show, in other words, did not start life as a show built for children and then quietly develop an appetite for something darker along the way. It started life as an unsupervised student film made with total creative freedom about characters who already existed inside Quintel's own imagination before any broadcaster ever asked him to soften anything, and it was only afterward, once the network picked it up and put it on the air, that anyone external to Quintel himself was ever in a position to ask the show to be gentler than it wanted to be by instinct. The tone it down note that came later in the show's run was not, then, a correction applied to a show that had drifted off course. It was closer to a lid placed, gradually and only partially, on top of a pot that had been at a low simmer since long before Cartoon Network was ever involved at all. Knowing that changes how a handful of specific episodes land, because you start to realize you are not looking at isolated jokes. You are looking at the visible edge of something. The network actively reined in partway through the show's life. Take the episode In the House, where Rigby, left alone and increasingly paranoid, imagines an escalating sequence of violent ends for every member of the park staff. Muscle Man is flayed, High Five Ghost is crushed down into the shape of a telephone, Skips is incinerated outright, Benson is flushed down a toilet, Pops is shoved into a wardrobe and made to simply vanish. Mordecai himself is decapitated in the same fantasy. This is documented plainly across fan-maintained episode guides as one of the show's most disturbing sequences, and it earns that reputation honestly because it is staged with a level of visual specificity that has almost nothing in common with the show's usual comic register. Or take the season 3 premiere, Stick Hockey, which opens with a flashback to Benson's own youth, competing in a stick hockey championship alongside a rival who looks almost exactly like him, only orange. The rival wins his round, gets decapitated by the game's own equipment in the process, and delivers a line about how much fun the whole thing was supposed to be immediately before dying from the injury on screen. Or take Death Metal Crash Pit, where a climactic explosion at a concert does not simply hurt the crowd watching, it is drawn and animated with the crowd's skin and features dissolving, eyeballs shown hanging loose from their sockets, staged with a level of graphic detail that would not be out of place in material aimed at a much older audience. None of these moments are secret. They are documented, cited, and discussed openly across fan wikis dedicated to cataloging exactly this kind of content in children's animation. What is worth sitting with is not any single example, but the pattern they form together, especially once you know the network genuinely asked the creative team to dial it back. A comedy about two 20-something slackers working a groundskeeping job kept finding its way, episode after episode, into images of decapitation, flaying, incineration, and dissolving flesh, almost always delivered through a joke, almost always resolved by the next scene as though nothing happened, and almost always occurring inside a character's imagination, a story within a story, or a flashback, which is to say, always at one careful remove from the show's actual ongoing continuity. That distancing device matters. It let the writers put images on screen that a direct, plotted death simply would not have gotten past doors and practices, precisely because the horror was contained inside quotation marks the network could tolerate. The theory some longtime fans have built from this pattern is not really a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It is closer to a diagnosis. The argument is that regular show's writers were, almost from the beginning, working with an appetite for violence and dread, that the show's premise, its network, and its time slot could not actually accommodate directly, and so that an appetite kept finding side doors, imagination sequences, nightmare framing, Halloween anthologies, anywhere the show's own internal logic could plausibly excuse it. The real, on record note to tone things down is not proof of any hidden agenda, but it is proof that the impulse toward this material was strong enough and consistent enough that the people paying for the show noticed it and asked for less of it, which tells you the pattern was never an accident in the first place. That reframes the show's own Halloween tradition in a way worth pausing on. Regular Show ran a recurring anthology format for its Halloween specials, most explicitly under the banner Terror Tales of the Park, across multiple installments through the series. The wiki documents these specials plainly as the show's designated outlet for horror material, and on the surface, that framing makes them feel like a controlled seasonal release valve, a place the show could safely be scarier than usual because everyone understood the genre they had opted into for one night a year. But looked at against everything else, the recurring executions in the House, the decapitation in Stick Hockey, the melting crowd in Death Metal Crash Pit, none of which are Halloween episodes at all, the anthology specials start to look less like an exception. The show carved out for itself and more like the one place it was allowed to be honest, out loud, about a tone that had actually been present in the show's imagination the entire time. The show did not become dark once a year. It was dark constantly, in flashes, in nightmares, in throwaway gags, and the Halloween format simply gave that darkness a name and a costume it could wear openly instead of hiding it inside a joke. There is a specific kind of dread that belongs to Benson, separate from the physical horror cataloged above, and it comes from an episode called Think Positive, where the show does something it rarely does with him. It lets his anger go all the way to its logical end, instead of cutting away for a punchline. Benson spends most of the episode bottling frustration the way he does in dozens of other episodes, except this time, the show does not diffuse it. His internal anger, visualized through the gumballs that make up his head, catches fire, and the fire does not stay contained to a comic outburst. It grows until Benson himself becomes a white-hot ball of flame, hanging in the air, pulling everything nearby into itself and destroying it, including, notably, Muscle Man's own trailer. Fans have singled this out as one of the character's single, angriest, and most viscerally staged moments in the entire run, and it is worth asking what the show is actually telling you when the one character defined almost entirely by suppressed frustration finally gets an episode where that frustration is allowed to combust rather than simply escalate and reset the way it does everywhere else. Every other week, Benson yells, loses his temper, and the episode moves on, and the show treats his anger as a running joke about middle management stress. Think Positive briefly drops that framing and shows you what the anger actually is underneath the joke, which is something closer to a person on fire from the inside, capable of leveling property when the lid finally comes off. The show never really returns to that register with him again. It goes back to treating his temper as comic relief the very next episode, but for one episode, it let you see what the joke had been quietly describing the entire time. All of this points toward a reading of the show that sits underneath the Park as Purgatory theory a lot of longtime fans already know, but pushes it into less comforting territory. If regular show's writers had, by their own creators' account, a genuine appetite for violence, dread, and graphic consequence that the network kept having to manage, then the show's surface tone, warm, slow, gentle, endlessly forgiving of its characters' failures, starts to look less like the show's natural resting state and more like a tone that had to be actively maintained against something underneath it that wanted out. This is speculation, and it should be labeled clearly as speculation because there is no interview on record where anyone involved describes the show this way. But the pattern is consistent enough across 8 seasons that it is difficult to write off as coincidence once you have actually cataloged it. A show about slackers who cannot commit to their own lives kept generating images of bodies coming apart and kept doing it specifically inside the safe zones of imagination, flashback, and holiday anthology, where the network's tolerance was highest and the show's own guardrails were loosest. What you were watching week to week was never simply gentle. It was gentle on top of something that clearly, by the writer's own restrained candor about it, needed to be told to tone itself down. Turn now toward Pops's other family, because the theory surrounding Mr. Maillard is one of the few in this whole catalog that the show's own canon actually supports almost completely, and it gets darker the more plainly you state it rather than the more you speculate about it. Mr. Maillard is Pops's adoptive father, the owner of the park, established across the series as wealthy, severe, and impatient with nearly everyone except his son. Once the finale confirms what Pops actually is, a being born as the literal embodiment of pure good on another planet, fated from birth to eventually face his cosmic opposite in a battle for the fate of the universe, the entire shape of Mr. Maillard's life reorganizes itself around a single fact the show never states outright, but does not need to, because the math does the work for you. This man built and ran an entire public park, hired an entire rotating staff of groundskeepers and workers, and maintained that operation for decades as cover so that his adopted son could live an ordinary, unremarkable, protected life for as long as possible before the fight he was born for eventually came to collect him. That is not really a conspiracy theory in the sense the word usually implies. It is closer to a description of the plot's own internal logic, stated at its plainest. What makes it worth sitting with rather than simply noting and moving past is the emotional arithmetic underneath it. Mr. Maillard, per the show's own writing, knew from the beginning, or at minimum knew far earlier than his son did, that Pops was not simply his child in the conventional sense, and that whatever life Pops got to have on Earth was, structurally, temporary, contingent on a cosmic clock that was always going to run out. He built a park anyway. He hired a staff anyway, people he could be gruff with, snap at, dismiss, because none of that mattered next to the one relationship in his life he needed to protect completely. And when the show's final season finally forces the confrontation into the open, Mr. Maillard is not given a single dramatic scene where he explains any of this. He is simply present in the closing episodes, quieter than his usual register, and then he is gone from the narrative in the understated way the show tends to handle its exits. A Man spent what the show implies is decades of his life building an elaborate, expensive, fully staffed piece of camouflage around the person he loved most, knowing the entire time that the camouflage had an expiration date. He could not move, and the show lets him do all of that off screen, in silences, in the gap between scenes, without ever once making him say the thing out loud. That restraint is, in its own way, one of the more quietly devastating choices the writers made in the entire series, because it means the full weight of what this character went through is never handed to you. You have to assemble it yourself, out of the small tells the show gives you, and the arithmetic of what you already know is coming for his son. Death himself deserves a slower look too, not because his existence in the show is disturbing on its own, but because of what his constant, casual presence quietly trains you to accept about the value of a life inside this particular universe. He appears across the series as a recurring character, styled as a British biker, complete with leather jacket and motorcycle, established with a wife and a son named Thomas, treated by the show with a mixture of comic absurdity and genuine dignity. He has rules. He can, under specific circumstances, the show sets up more than once, be talked into returning someone he has already collected, usually through some kind of game, wager, or trick, the same governing logic that runs through nearly every major conflict resolution in the series. On its surface, this reads as charming, one more example of the show's fondness for treating the biggest possible stakes with the same structure as a friendly bet. Looked at differently, it describes a universe where death, the single most permanent fact most people will ever face, has been rendered almost completely negotiable, a rule that gets bent for this specific cast with a regularity that would be remarkable if the show ever paused long enough to remark on it. The disturbing version of that observation is not about Death himself, who the show treats gently and even warmly. It is about what the constant negotiability of death, stacked on top of everything already covered tonight. The imagined executions, the graphic flashback deaths, the cosmic resets, the immortality sentences, actually teaches an audience about consequence. If characters can be decapitated in a daydream, incinerated in a nightmare, flayed alive in a fantasy sequence, and none of it ever actually costs anything because none of it was ever real, inside the story's own continuity, and if even the one moment the show does treat as a genuine, permanent death, Pops's sacrifice in the finale, gets framed with such tenderness and such narrative inevitability that it reads more like a culmination than a loss, then the show has spent its entire run quietly rehearsing an audience, most of whom really were young people watching alone at odd hours, in the idea that death is either reversible, deferred, or, when it finally does land for good, beautiful. That is one of the more unsettling readings available here, not because the show is doing anything malicious, but because comedies built on constant, simulated mortality, especially ones aimed at a young adult audience, going through their own real anxieties about aging, mattering, and running out of time, are teaching something about death by sheer repetition, regardless of whether they mean to. Regular show never set out to be a meditation on mortality. It became one anyway, almost by accident, simply by returning to the well of staged death so many times across so many episodes that a pattern formed that the writers likely never sat down and planned. There is a colder, more mechanical reading of all of this that some corners of the fandom have pushed toward over the years, one that treats the show's constant loops, resets, and recurring threats, not as thematic coincidence, but as evidence of an actual test being run on the characters without their knowledge or consent. The theory holds that the recurring structure of the show, the way certain conflicts resolve through contests, the way certain lessons keep needing to be relearned across multiple seasons before finally sticking, the way certain threats return in slightly altered shapes rather than simply going away, indicates that the cast is inside something closer to a controlled evaluation than a normal life. Under this reading, the various cosmic beings who appear at the edges of the show's biggest crises are not simply antagonists. They are observers, and the park staff are, without their knowledge, being measured against a standard none of them ever agreed to be held to. The show never confirms this. The wiki does not stamp it as canon. It is speculation, and speculation of a fairly unprovable kind, resting more on pattern recognition than on any specific piece of dialogue. But it is worth naming here specifically because of how uncomfortably it echoes something that actually happened behind the scenes, something that is not speculation at all. The writers really were, by their own account, testing the boundaries of what they were allowed to make, episode after episode, until an outside authority stepped in and told them the results had gone further than acceptable and needed to be reined in. Fiction can end up mirroring its own production in strange ways, and whether or not the park staff were ever being tested by anything inside the show's universe, the people making the show absolutely were being tested in real time by the standards of the network paying for it, and the record of that testing, the note to tone it down, is one of the more genuinely eerie footnotes in the show's entire production history once you know to look for it. Let us sit for a while with the finale itself, because there is a detail in how the show chooses to end that gets discussed constantly as moving, and far less often discussed as what it actually is underneath the tenderness, which is a description of erasure. Pops does not simply die in the traditional sense at the end of the series. Hai and his brother are pulled together into a star, and ending the show stages with soft light and quiet music, framed less like combat and more like a long-delayed embrace. It is a genuinely beautiful piece of animation and one of the more mature choices Cartoon Network allowed onto a daytime lineup in that era. But strip away the staging for a moment and look at the mechanics. A being who spent his entire existence being protected from a fight he did not choose, kept ignorant of his own nature specifically so that he could have something like a normal childhood, ends his story by being consumed, along with his brother, inside the heart of a star, a location, and a method of death that leaves nothing behind. No body, no grave, no trace. The show gives you the emotional register of a peaceful ending, and it earns that register through years of careful character work, but it is asking you to accept peace as the correct response to total, physical, atomic disintegration of someone you have spent 7.5 seasons learning to love. There is a reading of that choice that treats it as one of the most quietly brave things the show ever did, refusing to let its main cosmic sacrifice be undone, refusing the easy resurrection, its own established rules about death, about negotiable mortality, about time travel could have technically permitted. Under that reading, the finale's insistence on permanence is the show's single most adult decision, the moment it finally refuses to let its own loopholes save it from consequence. There is another reading, less generous, that treats the totality of that ending, the star, the absence of remains, the swiftness of it, as the show finally admitting, in its very last major story beat, that it had never actually been comfortable holding the weight of death honestly across its run, and so it solved that discomfort the only way left available to it, by making the death so complete, so cosmic, so far removed from anything a human body actually experiences, that it stopped resembling death at all and started resembling myth instead. Myths do not require you to grieve the way an actual body requires you to grieve. They require you to be moved and then to move on, carrying the shape of the story rather than the weight of an actual loss. And the show, tellingly, does not actually let that ambiguity stand on its own for very long. In the finale's closing minutes, the park builds a statue of Pops alongside one of his adoptive father, so that what happened will not simply be carried in memory, but fixed permanently in stone, where the next 25 years of visitors can walk past it without ever needing to be told the story behind it. And then, in the show's very last image of him, the show does something that a story genuinely committed to leaving his death unresolved and total would not have needed to do at all. It shows you Pops again, watching over everything from what the show frames plainly as heaven, content, gentle, delighted, offering one last line about what a jolly good show it had all been. That is not the show simply letting a death be a death. That is the show reaching, in its final seconds, for the one consolation its own established mythology had left available to it, and taking it, gladly, rather than sitting in the silence the sacrifice would otherwise have demanded. Both of the earlier readings can still be true. The sacrifice really did happen, really was total, really cost him everything a body can be asked to give. But the show could not, in the end, bear to leave you there. It needed one more shot of him smiling from somewhere safe, watching the friends he saved grow old without him, and it gave itself that shot, because the alternative, letting the loss simply be a loss with nothing waiting on the other side of it, was apparently more than the show, for all its late season willingness to take real emotional risks, was finally prepared to ask of its own audience. Not everyone in that final stretch gets a shot like that, and the character who gets the least of it is the one who arguably needed it most. 25 years after the events of the finale, the show tells you plainly that almost everyone has left the park behind. Mordecai is a painter with a family of his own. Rigby finished the diploma he spent years avoiding and built a life with Eileen. Muscle Man has a house full of children. High Five Ghost moved across the world entirely into an ordinary, loving, unremarkable life making music with someone he loves. Every one of them, in other words, gets the thing. The show has been arguing all along is the actual point of growing up. A small, sustainable, ordinary life lived somewhere other than the place that raised them. Benson does not get that. 25 years later, Benson is still at the park. He has a wife by then, and a house full of cats, and the show is careful to give him at least that much domestic warmth. But his job, The actual sight of every anxious, dread-tinged look the show ever let flicker across his face, across 8 seasons, the job. The earlier theory in this video suggested he might never actually be allowed to leave. Turns out, in the show's own confirmed ending, to be exactly the job he is still doing a quarter of a century later, managing an entirely new staff of employees who were not even born when Mordecai and Rigby were slacking off in his office at the same park under the same gumball machine head that has been losing its temper at somebody week after week for the show's entire run and, apparently, for a very long time afterward as well. Everyone else got to leave. Benson got a raise, a wife, and the exact same desk. The show does not treat this as sad. It treats it, if it treats it as anything at all, as continuity, a nice detail letting you know the park itself endures even once its original cast has scattered into their separate futures. But set next to everything this video has already spent time on, the recurring look of dread the show occasionally let cross Benson's face mid-tantrum, the theory that he was the one character at the park who sensed, without ever being able to name it, that something about the place would not let him go. His eventual, confirmed fate reads less like a happy ending and more like a quiet confirmation of the thing the theory suspected all along. Every other character's arc argues that growing up means eventually finding your way to somewhere else. Benson's arc, the one the show actually gives him rather than the one fans might have hoped for on his behalf, argues the opposite, gently, without any fanfare at all, simply by leaving him exactly where the story found him, decades later, still doing the same job, still running the same park, the only person in that final scene, besides the one being who is quite literally incapable of dying, who never actually got to become anything other than what this specific place needed him to be. What follows the star is its own quiet unease, worth naming directly because most retrospectives treat it as purely comforting and skip past what it is also doing. The show jumps forward across a span of years and shows you the surviving cast settled into adult lives, spouses, careers, small houses, the entire staff scattered into the kind of ordinary futures the show has been arguing, across its whole run, are actually the point of growing up rather than a consolation prize. It is a generous ending, genuinely, and it deserves credit for refusing the more common television instinct to give its leads spectacular, oversized outcomes instead of plain, sustainable ones. But look at what the time skip actually requires from the audience emotionally. You are asked to accept an entire cosmic war, an entire mythology involving alien planets and universal resets and immortal guardians, and a god who burned to nothing inside a star. And then, in the space of a scene transition, you are asked to set all of that aside and simply be glad that Rigby finished his diploma and married someone patient, and Mordecai found quiet success as a painter. The show is not wrong to want both of those things to matter equally, but the tonal distance between them is enormous, and the speed with which the show moves from the second to the first, from cosmic annihilation to domestic contentment in under a single episode, is itself part of what makes the ending feel, on a rewatch, less like closure and more like a very carefully managed act of emotional triage. The show needed you to feel the loss and then needed you to stop feeling it quickly enough to end on warmth rather than grief, and the machinery required to accomplish that. The time skip, the soft lighting, the deliberate ordinariness of every remaining character's life is doing more structural work than it usually gets credit for. There is one more layer to Pops's story worth pulling all the way out into the light, because it concerns not what happened to him, but what almost certainly did not happen for him in the years before any of this reached him. The show establishes, and this part is canon rather than theory, that Mr. Maillard raised Pops specifically to be kept, in the show's own words, dim and gentle, sheltered from the knowledge of what he actually was for as long as possible. Consider what that actually requires of a childhood. It requires a level of engineered ignorance maintained across what the show implies is decades. A father managing not simply his son's environment, but his son's entire understanding of reality, filtering out anything that might lead him toward the truth of his own nature, doing so out of love, doing so, by every indication the show gives you, successfully. Pops does not find out what he is through his own growing awareness or through a natural process of maturing into the knowledge. He finds out because the universe eventually runs out of road to keep the truth from him, because the fight he was born for finally arrives regardless of how carefully his father tried to delay it. That is not a story about a character discovering himself. That is a story about a carefully maintained deception, finally failing under pressure. It was never actually built to withstand forever, only to withstand for a while. Everyone in this arrangement, Mr. Maillard managing the lie for years, Pops living entirely inside it without ever suspecting, comes out the other side of that arrangement, having lost something. Mr. Maillard loses the son he spent his whole life trying to protect. Pops loses every year he could have spent knowing and choosing rather than simply being kept. It is worth returning, before we go any further, to a smaller and more domestic piece of this same pattern, because it shows up in a character most people do not associate with anything dark at all. Muscle Man performs a version of himself, loudly, constantly, across the entire run of the show, insisting he is tough, insisting he is strong, framing his entire personality around a father. The show eventually reveals was a far gentler, more thoughtful man than the legend Muscle Man has built around his memory. That gap between the story Muscle Man tells about who his father was and who the show actually shows you his father to have been is not simply a character quirk. It is a portrait of a specific and common kind of grief, the kind where the person left behind reshapes the dead into something louder and more mythic than the truth, because the truth, the ordinary, gentle man his father apparently actually was, is somehow harder to carry than the exaggerated legend. Muscle Man is not performing toughness because he thinks it is funny. He is performing it because the alternative, sitting with the plain, unglamorous reality of who his father actually was and how ordinary that grief actually feels, is a harder thing to do out loud in front of coworkers every single day. The show treats this with real tenderness in its later seasons, particularly around his father's funeral, and the comedy around him never entirely goes away. But underneath the comedy the entire time has been a specific, quiet, and very human strategy for surviving loss by making it bigger and louder than it actually was. Return, for a moment, to the recurring theme of pairs that runs through the entire cast, because there is a darker inversion of it worth naming plainly. Mordecai and Rigby, pops and anti-pops, skips and walks. The show is genuinely, structurally built around the idea that two halves must eventually face each other for either to become whole. That reading gets discussed often as hopeful, a case for the necessity of connection. The darker version of the same structure asks what it means that almost every one of these pairings only resolves through loss. Pops and anti-pops resolve by both of them being consumed together. Skips and walks resolve only because walks effectively died the day Mona did, leaving skips to carry on as a kind of surviving remnant of a person who no longer fully exists. Even Mordecai and Rigby, the pairing the show treats most gently, only reach their fullest, most mature version of their friendship by the very end of the series, after decades, implicitly, of being unable to function as separate, fully developed adults apart from one another. The show's recurring structural argument that nobody in it grows up alone carries a hidden cost the show rarely names directly, which is that growing up inside this particular universe seems to consistently require somebody to be lost in the process. Every pair that gets resolved through a death, a disappearance, or a slow motion erosion bone of one half into the other. That is either a profound statement about the price of real intimacy, or it is evidence that this show, for all its warmth, could not actually imagine a version of growth that did not cost somebody something irreplaceable. There is a final theory worth ending on, and it is the quietest one, and possibly the most unsettling, precisely because of how little drama it requires to land. It concerns the park itself, and what happens to a place once the story built around it stops being told. The show's final shot is staged, by design, with unusual restraint, no extra scene, no post-credits return, an ending the show's own creators have described as intentional, a deliberate refusal to hand you a tidy final image in favor of something more ambiguous. Fans have read that ambiguity as hopeful, as a metaphor for adulthood being a state you build rather than a destination you arrive at. That reading is generous and consistent with everything else the show has argued across its run. But sit for a moment with the more literal version of what an ending like that actually means. The park, the house, the coffee shop, the snack bar, the entire small ecosystem of background characters. The show spent years quietly building without ever fully using. All of it simply stops being narrated. It does not get destroyed. It does not get a dramatic send-off. It simply goes dark the moment the show decides it is done telling you about it. The same way any place you used to know eventually goes dark in your own memory the moment you stop being told by anyone what is happening there. The show does not linger on that. It moves briskly from its emotional climax into its closing minutes, and then it is over, and the park you spent years learning the shape of continues existing, presumably, in whatever unnarrated space fictional places go once nobody is watching them anymore, which is to say, nowhere at all, except in the small, private, sealed off place inside you where you are still capable of imagining it. That is not a conspiracy. It is simply what happens to every fictional place once its story ends, and regular show is not unique in doing it. But this particular show spent so many hours convincing you the park was a real, lived in place full of people with their own unglimpsed lives running in parallel to the ones you got to watch, that the moment of its going dark lands with an unusual weight, because you had been trained, episode after episode, to believe there was more there than the show ever had time to show you, and the ending confirms, gently but completely, that there always was going to be a point past which none of that unexplored life would ever get narrated at all. Before we go any further down, it is worth stopping on a detail that most fans treat as pure atmosphere, background texture for the Halloween specials, and rarely stop to ask what it might actually be telling you about the physical rules of this universe. Across the run of the show, characters and objects at the park get possessed with a regularity that once you start counting, stops looking like a seasonal gimmick and starts looking like a structural feature of the setting itself. There are episodes where Benson gets possessed. There are episodes where the house itself gets possessed. There are episodes where the golf cart the staff uses every day gets possessed. The wiki documents these plainly, filed the way you would expect, as Monster of the Week storylines, individually harmless, each one resolved by the credits. But taken together, across 260 some episodes, the sheer volume of things at this specific location that turn out to be inhabitable by something from outside stops reading as coincidence and starts reading as a description of a place with unusually poor structural integrity between itself and whatever else is out there. A house that gets possessed once is a Halloween special. A house, a vehicle, and multiple members of staff who each individually get possessed across the years are evidence, if you are inclined to read patterns this way, of a location where the wall separating this reality from whatever presses against it from the outside has simply never been especially thick to begin with. The show does not treat any single instance of this as alarming. Nobody at the park ever sits down and says, out loud, that this keeps happening to them specifically, more than it seems to happen to anyone else, anywhere else. They absorb each incident the way they absorb everything else that happens to them, with mild annoyance and a joke, and then they move on, and the show moves on with them, and neither the show nor its characters ever pause to ask the obvious question a real person living through this many possessions might eventually be forced to ask, which is simply, why here? Why us? Why does whatever is out there keep finding its way in through this particular house, this particular cart, this particular gumball machine, more than it seems to anywhere else in the world the show otherwise treats as ordinary? That question never gets asked on screen. It only ever gets asked by the audience, years later, adding up episodes the show itself never asked you to add up. There is a harder, more grounded kind of dread running underneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with cosmic villains or possessed furniture, and it belongs to the plain economic facts of how these characters actually live. The show establishes, quietly and without much fanfare, that Mordecai and Rigby are not simply choosing to stay at this job out of loyalty or affection. They live in housing the park itself provides. Their income, to the extent the show ever specifies it, is modest at best. They cannot, at almost any point across the earlier seasons, afford their own separate apartments, their own separate lives, their own separate anything, and the show treats the threat of being fired, which recurs constantly across the series, with a weight that is genuinely disproportionate to the size of the job itself, precisely because losing this particular job would mean losing the roof over their heads in the same instant. That is not an exaggerated stake dressed up for comic effect. That is, in plain terms, precarious employment tied directly to precarious housing, the exact arrangement labor researchers spend entire careers describing as one of the more coercive structures a workplace can build into itself, because it means an employee is never simply choosing whether to tolerate a bad day at work. They are choosing whether to tolerate a bad day at work or become homeless by the following morning. The show never uses that language. It never frames the arrangement as exploitative, because doing so would puncture the comic tone it needs to maintain for the joke to keep working. But strip the jokes away and look only at the structure, and what you are left with is two young adults whose entire material stability, food, shelter, the roof over their heads, is controlled entirely by a single employer. They are also, on top of everything else, expected to save the universe alongside, on a near weekly basis, unpaid overtime that never once gets acknowledged as unpaid overtime, because the show has no interest in letting you notice it that way. Every time the show plays the threat of losing this job for laughs, it is quietly asking you to laugh at a stake that, described without any of the show's warmth, is genuinely frightening. The specific, unglamorous fear of an entire generation of young adults who came of age broke, housing insecure, and dependent on employers who could end their material stability on a whim. The show is gentle about this. It is also, underneath the gentleness, describing something that is not gentle at all. That same coercive structure extends outward past Mordecai and Rigby into the wider order. The show occasionally lets you glimpse at the edges of its main plot, the Guardians of Eternal Youth, the same institution that granted Skips his immortality. Consider what that institution actually does, described without the warmth the show usually surrounds it with. It identifies a young person in the immediate aftermath of the single worst night of his life, a night that has just ended with the girl he loved dead in front of him, and it responds to that grief by permanently altering the terms of his existence without, as far as the show ever indicates, offering him any real alternative or any real explanation of what 2.5 centuries of unaging life sentenced to periodically refighting the same enemy would actually feel like from the inside. The show frames this as a gift, and Skips, by every indication we get of his present-day temperament, has made a kind of peace with it, or at minimum has stopped visibly fighting it. But an institution that responds to a devastated teenager by binding him to an eternal, recurring obligation on their terms according to their calendar, is not, described plainly, offering charity. It is recruiting him at the exact moment he is least capable of understanding what he is agreeing to into a role that will outlast every single person he will ever meet afterward, Mordecai and Rigby included, all of whom will grow old and die while Skips remains exactly as he is, fixing things, staying calm, never once getting to simply stop. The show never asks whether he was given a real choice that night. It only ever shows you the result of whatever choice, real or not, was made. Pops's own story carries a related and rarely named horror, one that sits specifically inside the language the show itself uses to describe him. He is repeatedly characterized by the show's own writing and by the characters around him as dim, as slightly senile, as gently and permanently behind the ordinary flow of events other people navigate without effort. For most of the show's run, that characterization plays purely as comedy, a source of warmth and confusion jokes, and it is easy to watch for years without ever stopping to ask where that particular quality actually came from. Once the finale confirms that Pops's entire upbringing was a managed deception, engineered specifically to keep him from understanding what he was for as long as possible, the earlier characterization stops looking like an innate personality trait and starts looking like the visible residue of that management. A being raised specifically to remain unaware of an enormous foundational truth about his own existence is not simply going to end up quirky. I is going to end up, by design, someone who has been kept at a certain protective distance from full comprehension of his own life, which the show dresses up across its run as childlike delight and gentle confusion, but which, read against what we later learn about how deliberately that state was cultivated, starts to resemble something closer to engineered cognitive limitation, maintained for years by a father who loved him and also needed him to never fully understand what he actually was. That is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to sit with once you see it, because it means one of the show's most beloved and consistently gentle character traits, Pops's simplicity, his wonder, his inability to keep up with ordinary adult conversation, may not be who he actually is at all. It may be who decades of careful, loving management made him into, a version of himself built to survive being lied to for as long as the lie needed to hold. There is a version of the pairing theory covered earlier that gets more uncomfortable the more literally you take it, and it concerns Mordecai and Rigby directly rather than any of the cosmology surrounding them. Some corners of the fandom have argued, half seriously and half as a kind of thought experiment, that the two of them function less like two separate people who happen to be close friends and more like a single psychological structure split across two bodies, one half impulsive and irresponsible, the other half anxious and indecisive, unable to actually complete a thought or a relationship without the other one physically present to react to it. Under that reading, every fight between them across the show's run is not really an argument between two people. It is closer to an internal conflict given two separate faces to wear, and every reconciliation is not a repaired friendship so much as a brief, restored integration, two halves of one incomplete whole managing, temporarily, to function as a single, coherent adult. If you take that reading seriously, rather than as a cute metaphor, it becomes genuinely disquieting because it implies that neither of them, across the entire run of the show, is ever actually a fully separate, fully realized individual capable of standing entirely on his own. They grow, by the finale, into versions of themselves that finally hold real jobs, real relationships, real independent lives, and the show frames that growth as a triumph. But the theory underneath asks whether either of them was ever capable of reaching that point alone, or whether the entire show has actually been documenting two halves of one incomplete person slowly, painfully, across 8 seasons, learning to become whole only in each other's company, never once managing it apart. That is speculation, and it should be labeled clearly as speculation, resting more on the two characters' uncanny synchrony than on anything the show states directly. But it recontextualizes every scene where one of them makes a decision entirely dependent on what the other one is doing, which, across 260 plus episodes, turns out to be the vast majority of the scenes they are ever in together. One last piece of this belongs to the background of the show, rather than its center, and it is easy to miss precisely because it was designed to be missed. Across the run of the series, a small rotating population of minor recurring characters, snack bar workers, hot dog vendors, various nameless townspeople who drift in and out of individual episodes accumulate, in aggregate, a strange kind of quiet disposability. They appear for a season or two, get a small joke, a small arc, occasionally a starring moment in a single standout episode, and then simply stop appearing with no explanation, no farewell, no acknowledgement from the main cast that anyone has noticed their absence at all. The wiki catalogs these characters individually and read one at a time. None of it registers as anything more than the ordinary churn of a long-running show managing a large ensemble cast across many years of production, but read in aggregate as an actual pattern of people who lived and worked immediately adjacent to the park's daily life, and then simply vanished from the narrative without comment. It describes something closer to the way real communities quietly lose people, co-workers who move on, acquaintances who drift out of your life without a final conversation, neighbors who are simply gone one day and stay gone, and nobody around you ever quite says anything about it because there was never really a relationship substantial enough to justify saying anything. The show's two lead characters, so carefully and warmly written everywhere else, are shown, through this recurring absence of acknowledgement, to be almost entirely unaware of the actual scale of the community living and working immediately around them. It is a small, structural blind spot, built into the show's own point of view rather than into its plot, and it means that for as much as regular show wants to be a show about noticing the people around you, its own camera consistently fails to notice the ones who were never important enough to the plot to be worth a goodbye. There is another current running through the show that gets discussed constantly as one of its most charming qualities, and almost never discussed as what it might actually be doing to the two characters living closest to it. Regular show is steeped, visually and musically, in the specific aesthetic of the 1980s: arcade cabinets, synthesizer scores, boom boxes, action movie tropes, an entire sensibility that belongs to a decade neither Mordecai nor Rigby, by any reasonable accounting of their apparent age, actually lived through as adults. The show treats this constantly as affectionate homage, a love letter from writers who grew up on that decade's pop culture to the pop culture itself, and on that level, it plainly is exactly that: a stylistic choice with a clear, sincere, well documented creative lineage running back to the creator's own childhood and influences. But look at what the show actually does with that aesthetic dramatically, rather than simply visually, and a stranger pattern appears. The show's own mythology repeatedly treats artifacts of that decade specifically, not culture in general, but this particular culture, as objects with real supernatural weight. An old electric instrument found gathering dust in an attic turns out to be capable of bending reality itself. An arcade cabinet becomes, more than once, a literal portal. A high score chitin decades ago by a character who could not let it go eventually returns as a vengeful, undead antagonist, unable to rest until someone finally beats his record and lets him go. None of these are treated by the show as ordinary props. They are treated as objects that retain a kind of charge, a residue of the era that produced them, capable of reaching forward and pulling the present back into itself when the wrong person handles them carelessly. Read as a pattern rather than as isolated jokes, this starts to describe something closer to a haunting than a homage. The theory some longtime viewers have built from it argues that the show's nostalgia is never actually presented as purely warm or purely safe. It is presented again and again as something with teeth, something that can reach out and take hold of a person who loves it too uncritically for too long without ever moving past it. Every time Mordecai and Rigby get pulled into another artifact of a decade that is not, strictly speaking, theirs to be nostalgic for at all, since neither of them was old enough to have lived through it the first time around. The show is quietly asking a question it never answers directly. What does it mean that two young men can be endangered repeatedly by their own inherited attachment to a culture that belongs to an era before their own coherent memories even begin? The uncomfortable version of that question is this: the show may be dramatizing, without ever naming it outright, the specific danger of a generation raised on borrowed nostalgia, adults who grew up worshiping a decade they never actually lived in, chasing a feeling of a past that was never, strictly, their own to miss in the first place, and finding that the chase can genuinely hurt them, can trap them, can very nearly cost them their lives, precisely because the thing they are chasing was never designed to let them go easily once they reached for it. The show does not resolve this tension so much as it keeps restaging it, season after season, letting its two leads get pulled back into the past's gravity again and again, without ever quite letting them fully outgrow the pull. Whether that outcome is intentional commentary or simply the natural byproduct of a creative team writing what they personally loved is not something the show ever states, and it should be treated honestly as a reading rather than a confirmed intention. But the pattern, once counted, is difficult to write off as coincidence. There is a related unease that surfaces specifically in the show's Christmas specials, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than folded into the earlier discussion of cosmic scale because it points somewhere slightly different. In these episodes, Santa Claus is established within the show's own internal logic as an actual being with actual cosmic level power, capable of real intervention in the world the park staff otherwise treats as ordinary. Taken alongside everything else, the show eventually reveals the existence of death as a recurring character with a wife and a son, the existence of pops and anti-pops as beings born to maintain universal balance, the existence of an entire order of immortal guardians, quietly managing threats across centuries. A single, quiet implication starts to take shape, and it is this: the world Mordecai and Rigby believe they are living in, an ordinary town, an ordinary park, populated mostly by ordinary people, going about ordinary lives, is not actually anywhere close to ordinary. It is underneath its ordinary surface, densely populated by enormous, ancient, extraordinarily powerful entities who all apparently already know of each other's existence, who move through the same general cosmic community, and who choose, for reasons the show never explains, to keep almost all of that reality hidden from the overwhelming majority of the people living directly on top of it. Mordecai and Rigby only ever get let in on fragments of this larger picture because their jobs happen to place them directly in its path. Everyone else in their world, every other resident of the town the park sits inside, is presumably living out an entire life without ever once suspecting that Santa Claus, Death, an alien god raised in secret as a human child, and an ancient order of immortal guardians, are all real, all active, and all quietly coexisting somewhere just outside the edges of what an ordinary resident is ever shown or told. That is not a comforting thought once you actually sit with its scale. It describes a world with a hidden governing layer running invisibly behind the visible one, a layer only a tiny handful of people, almost entirely by accident of employment, ever get any real glimpse of, and it means that for every resident of that town who never worked a single shift at that specific park, the true shape of the reality they were born into simply never gets revealed to them at all. They live and die generation after generation, completely unaware of how much larger and stranger the actual architecture of their world really is. The show never frames this as sinister. It frames Mordecai and Rigby's access to this knowledge as a kind of privilege, dangerous but ultimately meaningful. But privilege of that kind, described honestly, means that somebody, somewhere, made a decision, consciously or through inherited custom stretching back further than anyone alive could trace, that the ordinary residents of this world did not need to know, and were better off, by design, not knowing what was actually sharing the world with them the entire time. One more piece of this same architecture is worth naming directly, because it concerns something the show simply never comments on, and its silence is itself worth sitting with. Across the run of the series, some characters age in ordinary, visible, human time, and others simply do not, and the show moves between these two categories so smoothly, so without friction, that it is easy to watch the entire run without ever consciously noticing how strange the imbalance actually is. Mordecai, Rigby, Benson, Muscleman, Eileen, Margaret, all of the show's ordinary mortal characters age the way people actually age, slowly across the show's real-world run, and then dramatically in the finale's time skip, gaining lines, gaining families, gaining the visible wear of decades finally caught up to them all at once. Skips does not age at all, has not aged in 2.5 centuries, and by every indication the show gives you, is not going to start now. Death does not age, cannot age, exists entirely outside the category. Pops, once his true nature is revealed, was arguably never aging in any way that mattered. His apparent human lifespan, a kind of costume laid temporarily over something that had already existed for a length of time. The show never even attempts to specify in numbers a person could meaningfully hold in their head. Sit with what that actually means for the emotional experience of everyone else in the cast. Every ordinary character at this park has spent their entire working life standing directly next to at least one being who will never age, never die of natural causes, never lose the people he loves to the plain, unglamorous erosion of time. The rest of them are all quietly, inevitably subject to, and the show never once has any of its mortal characters actually reckon with what that must feel like, working for years beside someone who will, by simple virtue of what he is, watch every single one of them grow old and disappear while he remains exactly, precisely as he has always been. Skips will attend, in the fullness of time, the show's own logic all but guarantees funerals for every person currently working at that park. He very likely already has, more than once, across the 2.5 centuries preceding the version of him we get to watch. The show gives you exactly one full episode, addressing what that cost him the first time with Mona, and then simply never returns to the subject again, letting him carry it silently for the rest of the series, while everyone around him ages forward into their own separate mortal futures, never quite pausing long enough to ask him what it is actually like to be the only one at the table who is never going to leave that table the way everyone else eventually will. Go back for a moment to Death himself, because there is a detail in how the show humanizes him that becomes stranger rather than warmer the longer you sit with it. The show gives him a wife. It gives him a son, Thomas, established as an apparently ordinary child, living an apparently ordinary domestic life, alongside a father who spends his working hours collecting the souls of the recently deceased. The instinct, watching this the first time, is to find it charming, a clever bit of world building that humanizes an otherwise abstract cosmic function by giving it a family to come home to. But look at the actual arrangement being described. Here is a being who, by every indication the show gives you, still has to go to work. Death does not get to retire simply because he has found love, simply because he has a child who needs him at home, simply because, like anyone else with a family, there are surely nights he would rather not put on the leather jacket and get on the motorcycle and go do what the job requires of him. He does it anyway, because the job does not pause for grief, does not pause for a son's birthday, does not pause for anything at all, And the show, rather than treating that as tragic, treats it as almost sweet, a workaholic dad joke layered on top of the single most consequential job description in the entire show's universe. There is something quietly unsettling about a narrative that can look directly at an entity whose job is to personally, individually, attend the death of every single being in its jurisdiction, night after night, forever, with no possibility of promotion, retirement, or relief, and land on domesticity as the primary emotional takeaway rather than exhaustion, rather than grief fatigue, rather than the specific, bottomless loneliness of being the one figure every living thing eventually has to face alone. The show wants you to find him endearing, and largely you do. But endearing is doing a great deal of quiet work to keep you from asking what it must actually cost a person, even a cosmic one, to spend an unbroken eternity meeting people at the single worst moment of their entire existence, and then going home afterward to make sure his own son gets to bed on time. Return, finally, to the anthology format the show built specifically to hold its scariest material, because there is one more layer to it worth naming plainly before we start climbing back toward the surface. Terror Tales of the Park ran across multiple installments over the show's run, and within its individual stories, the show reliably reaches for material more overtly frightening than almost anything. It allows itself the rest of the year a haunted bed that turns out to have once been an actual living killer, a wallpaper installer who turns out to be an enormous, predatory spider, story after story staged with a level of straightforward horror genre commitment the ordinary weekly episodes rarely attempt. The framing device the show uses to hold these stories together is itself worth noticing. The characters gather, tell each other stories, wager their own Halloween candy on whose tale is the scariest, and the show lets each storyteller reach for whatever unsettling image serves the story best, safely contained inside quotation marks. Nobody has to take as literally true. It is easy to watch these specials as pure, harmless seasonal indulgence, the one night a year the show gets to try on a different genre before returning, obligation fulfilled, to its ordinary tone. But given everything covered tonight, the 14 billion year cycle of failed universes, the ghost who never got to explain his own death, the immortal man sentenced to relive his worst night on a recurring clock, the network note asking the writers to tone down an appetite for violence that kept surfacing anyway, the possessions that never stopped happening long enough for anyone at the park to ask why. It becomes harder to treat the anthology specials as an exception carved out of an otherwise gentle show, and easier to treat them as the one occasion each year the show was given explicit permission to be exactly as unsettling as it apparently wanted to be the entire time, everywhere, quietly, underneath the jokes, all along. The costume the anthology wears, ghost stories told around a fire, gives the show cover to be honest about a tone it otherwise had to keep managing, disguising, and folding back down into comedy for the other 360 some days of the year. Take the costume off, and what is left is not a show that occasionally visits horror. It is a show that lived inside horror's proximity the entire time and only ever admitted it out loud when the calendar gave it permission to. It is worth pausing on the 2015 feature film as well, released between the show's later seasons, because in hindsight it plays less like a lighthearted side adventure and more like a rough first draft of the exact fear the finale would eventually make literal. The plot, confirmed plainly across the film's own production record, involves a version of the future where a corrupted cyborg Mordecai, twisted by events that trace back to a moment in Mordecai and Rigby's shared adolescence, personally shoots and kills Rigby with a weapon built for exactly that purpose. Benson, in that same future, sacrifices his own life so that Rigby can escape backward through time and prevent the whole disaster from happening at all. The film resolves itself the way these stories usually do, by undoing the damage, closing the loop, letting everyone walk away from a future that technically still happened, technically still cost Benson his life, and cost Rigby his, but which gets folded away the moment the timeline corrects itself. Exactly the same trick the finale would later use on a much larger, much more consequential scale. What makes the film worth revisiting through tonight's lens is how casually it lets its two best friends rehearse the worst possible version of their relationship, one where the bond between them curdles into something that ends in a plasma weapon and a body on the ground, and then how quickly it lets the entire cast walk that scenario back into non-existence, using breakfast burritos and a punctuality joke as the note it chooses to land on instead. The show, even 4 years before its own ending, already understood that its two leads' friendship was fragile enough, under the right conditions, to end in genuine violence between them. It simply was not ready yet to let that possibility mean anything permanent. That readiness would not arrive until the finale, and even then, as we have already seen, it arrived carrying a heaven shot and a marble statue right behind it, just in case permanence turned out to be more than the show could actually bear to leave unresolved. What is strange, sitting with all of it laid out end to end like this, is how little any single piece of it actually contradicts the show you remember loving. Nothing tonight required rewriting a single episode or inventing a villain the writers never put on screen. Every theory here was built entirely out of material the show already gave you freely in plain sight across 8 seasons that most of us watched half paying attention, late at night, laughing at the parts that were funny and letting the rest slide past without asking where it actually came from. The cosmic reset was always in the finale's own dialogue. The unexplained death was always sitting quietly inside High Five Ghost's design from the very first episode. The network's own real note about tuning things down is a matter of public record, not fan theory at all. The show never hid any of this from you. It simply trusted, correctly, for the vast majority of its runtime, that you would be too busy enjoying yourself to go looking for it, and it built enough warmth around every dark edge that going looking never felt necessary the first time through. That trust is not a flaw in the show. It might be the single most impressive thing about it, the sheer amount of unresolved weight it managed to carry for years without most of its audience ever feeling the load. That is the shape of tonight's descent, from a 14 billion year cycle of failed universes down through a ghost who never got to say how he died, down through an immortal man sentenced to refight the worst night of his life every century and a half, down through a show that kept quietly reaching for images of bodies coming apart until the people paying for it told the writers to stop, down through a father who spent his whole life managing a lie he knew would eventually cost him everything, down through a manager who never actually got to leave the desk that had been quietly haunting him since the very first season, down to a park that simply goes dark the moment nobody is left to keep telling you what is happening inside it. None of this erases what the show also was: patient, funny, generous, sincerely kind to almost everyone who passed through it. Both things were always true at once. The comfort and the dread were built out of the same hands, on the same schedule, sometimes inside the very same scene. That is probably closer to how most things that hold real weight in your memory actually work. They are never only warm. The warmth simply tends to be the part that gets remembered out loud, while the rest of it waits quietly underneath, ready to be found again on a night like this one, when you have the time to go looking for it on purpose. If you found something in tonight's video worth sitting with, the kindest thing you can do for a channel like this one is press the like button before you drift off. And if you have not subscribed yet, that small click is the entire reason videos like this keep getting made at all. There is more of the park left to walk through than any single video can hold, and there will be another night for the rest of it. Sleep well wherever you are tonight. The park is still out there, quiet and dark and waiting, the way it always was underneath everything warmer we told ourselves about it.